couple of quick housekeeping rules. Keep your phones on silent, please, but don't turn them off. We encourage you to share on social and tag Callaghan Innovation. Please note we've got an external audience joining us here today via webinar, so they can all see you guys. Give them a wave. We will be recording this event and we'll share that with you guys, as well as Eric's PowerPoint slides after the event. If you need to use the bathroom, please take a pass, make your way around the side of the kitchen to the bathrooms. You'll need the swipe card to get back into the room. And lastly, in terms of fire evacuation procedure, if the alarm sounds, everyone should leave through the marked exits, head down the stairs to the foyer. The assembly point is on Key Street next to the closest ferry terminal. So let's get straight into it. New Zealand companies can expect to be impacted by the EU's harmonisation of select regulations regarding the digital single market and new data protection rules. From the end of geo-blocking to the right to explanation on algorithmic decision-making, new copyright framework and VAT rules, these policies will change the playing field for companies around the world, including EU companies, partners, and businesses exporting digital products and services to the region. The format of this morning's presentation is 40 minutes from Dr Erich Prem to explore the opportunities and impacts for innovative New Zealand businesses arising from Europe's changing regulatory environment. I'm sure there'll be plenty of questions through the presentation, but if you can hold them to the end, we'll be doing a 20-minute Q&A at the end of it. So I'll now pass it across to my colleague, Jonathan Miller, to introduce our speaker and to moderate the Q&A session afterwards.
Well, good morning, everyone. And just in the chats with people before, just now, it was really interesting to hear people with all sorts of interesting challenges associated with collecting data, health data, tourism data, and so I feel like the topic's a real hot one, and it'll be great to hear Eric's talk. Dr. Erich Prem is CEO of Eutema, which is a research strategy consultancy based in Vienna, Austria. Callaghan Innovation is partnered with Eutema on a collaborative sort of partnership. We're exploring ways that New Zealand and EU can work closer on research and development collaboration, especially around the area of ICT. Erich has got a PhD in computer science, a doctoral degree in philosophy, and an MBA degree in general management. And being so close to the action in the EU, I think he's really well placed to give us some thoughts and insights on the topic. So, and that kind of changing regulatory environment. So, nō reira, nau mai haere mai ki te motu, Dr. Erich Prem. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Erich Prem.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you and good morning. I have to say this is a first. I've never given a talk so early in the morning, but that's all right. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to talk about this highly unlikely subject in New Zealand. Unlikely just because it's about policy in Europe, and the question naturally may arise, why would I talk in New Zealand about European politics? And the reason why I think you may be interested is because some of these policy changes that are about to happen may actually impact, well, globally, really. They have an influence on whoever processes data of European residents. And that's what I'm going to talk about. However, as Jonathan said, my background is I'm neither a politician nor a legal expert, really. My background is research management and research strategy, so the twist of this talk is to present it from the point of view of innovation and research. What are the new research and innovation challenges that come with these challenges? So that's roughly what I would like to talk about. Jonathan mentioned EPIC. EPIC is an EU-funded project. That's actually the reason why I'm here. So the European Commission paid for this trip, which is nice. And what we're doing in this project, we are organizing events like this. We try to improve the policy dialogue between the European Commission and New Zealand, also between the European Commission and Australia and Singapore. We do a little bit of funding of research exchanges. So we had a call out for people, for example, from New Zealand who want to go to Europe and the other direction. The call is still on the web page, so if you're interested, look it up. And in the end, the aim is to improve the strategy also with respect to a bit of a longer term perspective. So how can Europe and New Zealand improve collaboration in this area of ICT research and innovation? The partnership in this project, as Jonathan already briefly mentioned, Callaghan is a partner, also the University of Canterbury. In Europe, it's us from Eutema, and then we have 2 partners in Australia and Singapore as well. Let me start with some basic facts about the European Union. I think maybe from your perspective, the most interesting element is that the EU is still a very large market, actually one of the largest markets in the world. It has only been outperformed by China recently. So I think that's probably the point of view where I focus on the market side, but it's also a very interesting area in terms of research and innovation. It has an excellent science and technology base with a lot of actors in diverse areas. We are moving towards a single market in many areas, one of them being digital services and products, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And of course, like all industrialized nations, also Europe is investing heavily in digitizing their industry. You may have heard the term Industry 4 or Industry 4.0, which I think actually was invented in Germany. So there are plenty of these initiatives throughout Europe. So actually each member state in Europe has their own programs to digitize industry. And it's quite massive, really, what's happening there. It involves research topics, but it's also something that happens in practice in small and large companies and many different levels. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because this is just one aspect of this massive digitization of society. And the question naturally arises, so what are the impacts on society of these developments? And one element is certainly the question of data protection and how to deal with personal data. And that is something that the European Commission has looked into and is what I'll tell you in the second part of my talk. As said, the European Union has a very rich and very diverse technology base. There is a very long tradition. There are centuries of research, obviously, happening in a number of centers. It's very difficult in Europe to point you to the places where sort of the most interesting things happen, because it's very diverse and a multicultural research environment. But I wanted to point out a few things that are related to Industry 4.0 and digitization. So electronics and microelectronics are some traditional specific EU strengths. For example, power electronics, whereas let's say the memory chips, they have gone to the US and nowadays to China, but power electronics is still something that's very strong in Europe. Industrial control systems, hyperphysical systems, embedded systems, things that you have in your car, or communication technology. GSM basically was invented actually in a European research initiative. So there are these topics that we would also like to focus on in this project, partially. But the second part to the game is, of course, the question of innovation and what you do with these technologies. And what you can do is often regulated by lawmakers. And the reason I'm talking today about this topic is that we are about to see a massive change in the regulatory framework for dealing with private data. And regulation can be a showstopper of innovation, so it's really important to keep in mind what's going on here. The regulatory environment is changing for a range of reasons. So one is what I'm going to talk about, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. The policy developments in the digital single markets are another reason. A third reason, which is probably not completely irrelevant for New Zealand as well, is Brexit. We already see some, that's probably going to have more practical implications than, let's say, legal ones. So, for example, we see currently a lot of companies moving their headquarters actually somewhere to a non-Brexit state, so EU 26. And of course, the European Commission has only recently announced or proposed actually trade negotiations between Europe and New Zealand, also between Europe and Australia. So that is all going to be really interesting, and it creates some additional dynamics for what we are doing here. Let me first start with the digital single market. So, as you know, the Europe is made up of a number of member states, and of course, historically, they all have developed their own rules for the markets. And a lot of what the European Commission does is bring member states together and agree on joint rules between the member states, for example, for trade or other areas of the economy. And in many areas, I think, we have pretty much achieved a common market. So you can nowadays buy products in one member state and ship them to another member state, and it's basically very clear how this works. But for certain markets, this has not yet happened. And one market where this is still relatively difficult, and there are a lot of issues when you buy, for example, a digital service in Germany and want to use it in France, and that's something that the Commission is now targeting, to develop a digital single market. So areas that this concerns are e-commerce, but it includes, for example, parcel delivery. Nowadays, if you ship something from Vienna to Salzburg, which is 300 kilometers, it will cost you less than shipping it from Bratislava to Vienna, which is only 50 kilometers, obviously because it crosses a member state boundary. And while this is not truly a digital problem, it is in close connection to developing the digital single market, obviously. So this is quite challenging. Geo-blocking, I'm going to talk about. Geo-blocking means that you cannot access a service in a different member state because you're geographically blocked from using that service. There's a lot of issues with copyright, as you can imagine, maybe, because traditionally each member state had their own copyright rules. One of the favorites of the Commission and the member states is VAT, value-added tax. Is a tricky one. But then there are also things that are, let's say, a bit more infrastructure type criteria for the single market, such as telecoms, or how to deal with online platforms, how to deal, obviously, with personal data, standards, skills, and e-government. So these are all policy topics that the Commission has started to tackle. And I'll give you one example to make this a bit easier to understand. Today, when a French consumer subscribes, for example, to a Canal Plus film online, then the user may be blocked in a different member state from using that. So when this French lady, for example, goes to Croatia for vacation, she may not be able to access the content. In the future, this will no longer be allowed. So in the future, and in the future means actually in a few months, this lady has to be enabled to use the service like home. And this is really important. It's very interesting. It's a typical European way of implementing things. It doesn't mean that every European citizen has access to the same services. It just means when this French consumer moves to a different country, then at that point she can still access the things like she ordered them back home. Yeah. Many friends of mine said this is actually not the way we wanted things, because when it's sometimes nice to go to, I don't know, nowadays to the UK and watch different films online. So I won't be able to do that. I will still be able to watch those things to which I have subscribed. But this is something that anybody who offers a service will have to implement. It's not an option. You must not make, in the future, you must not make a decision, distinguish between the place of where you are in Europe to access the services. So this will enable consumers to access their online content services when they travel in the EU. It's valid for all providers offering paid services. It's important, it's only for paid service. You can still make a difference if it's a free service. and how you verify this, in which country you are and where you're from, is also regulated in these regulations. It's going to be in place, I think, in 2 months from now. So that's just one example. There are other forms of geo-blocking. Some of them will still be allowed, but as you can imagine, this is a complex issue. It's complex because, and that relates to the free services, it's complex because of the underlying IPR rights. So you know how difficult it is, for example, for sports rights, for TV broadcasters to negotiate them. And of course, nowadays, the national broadcasters have the right to broadcast that nationally. And this will still be the case in the future. So is this when you dig down to the detail, it's still very complex. But for paid services, the rule is going to change, as I said. So and this is just one example. There are many other areas. For example, I mentioned parcel delivery. I mentioned unjustified geo-blocking. But there is also now a new electronic VAT register that should make it easier for companies to sell their services and pay the VAT only in one country. There are regulations with respect to the business environment, such as the telecom. The telecoms will get new frequencies, for example, as a result of these policy initiatives. There will be new rules for online platforms. For example, it will be made easier to move between online platforms. I'll talk about this in a second. And then there are also policy initiatives that relate to skills or e-government. So it's quite a complex policy framework. Last year, the Commission delivered a midterm assessment of all these policies for the digital single market. And we have actually seen already that some of these policies had massive impact. So I think one change in policies that most Europeans affected quite significantly was the elimination of roaming charges. So until recently in Europe, when you had a contract, for example, like in my case with an Austrian telecom provider, and I moved to Germany, I had to pay roaming charges for my phone calls, and in particular for my data downloads. Now that has changed. We now have, since less than a year, we have a concept in place which is called Roam Like Home, which means I must not be charged more than what I am charged at home. It's again the same concept. So still there are no real pan-European telecom providers, but I can access the service for the same cost in Germany now than what I pay back home. And that already led to a six-fold increase in downloads. Not all of this may be due to the elimination of the roaming charges, but it had a significant effect. So yes, I said cross-border portability of online content will be in place early 2018. There will be initiatives to boost connectivity throughout Europe, one of which is to basically liberating the 700 megahertz band for wireless broadband in all member states. There is a special fund for improving connectivity throughout Europe. And so, for example, there's the Wi-Fi for EU initiative that aims at connecting for a free connectivity for the citizens in up to 8,000 local communities, which is quite significant. As always in these cases, we'll see if the local communities co-fund, but if they do, this can make a real change. And then finally, the changes to the data protection. What's going to happen in the future? So what's not yet done? There will be initiatives on cross-border free flow of non-personal data. So what I'm talking about today, keep in mind, is about personal data, but of course a lot of data is also non-personal. There are currently restrictions between member states which are possible, and they are still legally okay, but that is going to be addressed as well. There is going to be an initiative on access to and reuse of publicly funded data, so data that has been generated, for example, through research projects or other initiatives, or even in areas such as public transport or from utilities. So the Commission will regulate that. We have seen a new European Agency for Network and Information Security, in the area of cybersecurity, and we'll see what they actually do. But we expect there will be new standards. There's going to be initiatives on certification, on labeling, especially for connected objects, so machine-to-machine data. Yeah, the online platforms are a specific target of the European Union. So the Commission will continue to address unfair contractual clauses when you sign up for a platform, trading practices. There's a range of topics here really that the Commission targets, from competition, how to remove illegal content, counterfeit goods, hate speech. So all of these things, we will see regulations in 1 or 2 years coming up. Yeah, and there should be massive investments still in digital skills and infrastructure. But let me now talk about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. How am I doing with time? 20 minutes?
Very good.
Okay. So this is a regulation. I won't spare you the details of the European legal system, but a regulation means that the European Commission and the Parliament decide something and it has immediate legal character. There is another another type of how to create laws in Europe, and that is actually the previous data protection rules had to be implemented by the member states, which always means that there is great variation between what the member states actually do. But in this case, it's different. It actually means that pretty much today, in 4 months, this regulation will be effective, and it is it defines the rules for every European citizen, and as you will see, also for companies outside Europe. The aim is to improve data protection. Now, there has been a lot of argument whether this actually improves data protection or whether it actually weakens the data protection in some parts. I'm not going to talk about this, but it is certainly a reaction to new technologies, to, in particular, platforms and business models that have emerged. Most important business model, selling private data of natural persons and trading with that. Now, the new regulation defines personal data very broadly. Basically, it's not just the name of a person. It includes such things as a person's location, a person's IP address, even cookies on your computer. Whenever the natural person is somehow identifiable with reasonable effort. And for the computer scientists among you, this should come as a kind of shock because identifiable is very broad. It's just the question is, how much effort do you spend to make this person identifiable? And that, of course, will remain to some extent well, what's going on then when the law is challenged. So we don't know yet what it precisely means, but it is a broad definition of what identifiable natural person means. The second thing that has really changed now, or is going to change, is that the fines are very high, or can be very high. So it can be up to 20 million euro, or 4% of the global gross revenue, whichever is higher. So that is a lot of money, and it should be clear who is targeted here. If you don't know, you can Google it. Yeah. So what is the GDPR changing? So it means in practice for the consumer that there will be very clear rules for how to give consent and on what you have to ask for sort of consent. There will be a very clear right to access your own data and to know what the company, for example, has stored about you. There will be a right to data portability. So that is something that has to do with platforms. Whenever you have sort of your data on a platform, the platform in the future will have to support you moving to a different platform. So they will have to give you your data, not just that, but they will also have to provide it in a common format so that it makes it easier for you to switch between platforms. There are now very clear rules in the GDPR what should happen if there is a breach of your privacy. If, for example, you have been hacked, in most cases within actually 72 hours, you'll have to notify the authorities, and in most cases you will also have to notify the person whose data was, for example, stolen. There will be special rules for profiling. I'll talk about this. You will have a right to be informed when you are the subject of algorithmic decision making. There is a famous European concept now which is called the right to be forgotten. In the new GDPR, it has unfortunately been named differently. Now it's called the right to erasure. I sort of prefer the right to be forgotten. I'll talk about this. And for the computer scientists or computer responsible people among you, the privacy I'm talking about here is not just some superficial one. It's really the target of the GDPR is that you have to implement measures which by design will keep your data private. So for example, through anonymization or state-of-the-art techniques that you're using. And that is a very interesting development because it creates this relation between innovation, what's happening in the company and research as well, because you have to maintain the state of the technology. You cannot just implement it once and then forget it. Let me start by the right to be forgotten, a famous concept, I think, invented by Vivian Redding. It's something we already have in place in Europe. It has now been newly regulated. It simply is the right to have your data erased when it's no longer relevant or no longer needed for the reasons for which it was originally collected. This has some severe implications for IT systems. So let me give you the classical example is where this comes from is by legal offenders who, after spending their time in prison, they have the right to start from scratch. Right? And so the records about their crime had to be deleted and still have to be deleted. And basically this is the same concept just in the electronic world. Another example is imagine someone who has a gender transforming surgery and he becomes a she and she wants to have all references to her previous male identity removed. As you can imagine, this is quite a tricky thing to do. It's something that in most cases will affect, for example, companies like Google. And what Google has to do, and this is actually already in place in Europe, it has to remove the links to this person's previous gender online. In practice, what happens, and what Google does this, there's actually thousands of cases where they implement such requests. When you then Google information about that person, you will get the information that this link has been removed for legal reasons. It does not necessarily delete the original data, because that would be close to impossible, but it removes the link to that information. And interestingly, when you do the same thing outside Europe, what used to happen, I'm not sure what's happening now, but what used to happen is you just don't get the information, but you don't get the information that the information was removed. Anyway, so that's how Google implemented this, but this is in place and it will continue to be in place. Okay? And it's a right of a European citizen to have data about them removed. This is the right to erasure or the right to be forgotten. In many cases, this will need further clarification, and we're going to see a lot of court cases, but basically that's the rule. Another important thing which I like to point out in presentations like this one is profiling and discrimination. So many people talk about big data and what you can do with it, but they forget to mention that, of course, there is, let's say, a dark side to big data, and that is precisely privacy. And you can discuss it under the title of profiling and discrimination. So profiling is automated processing to evaluate certain personal aspects, and then, for example, borrow you money or not. To make this the classic case is creditworthiness. Now, you cannot just use any data for doing that, because there are just such things as anti-discrimination rules, and they are deeply rooted in the European legal systems. So, for example, deciding on creditworthiness depending on race would be simply illegal, and you cannot do that. And of course, that is also the case when you do it electronically. It doesn't change things. So this in particular relates to sensitive data, racial or ethnic origin, political opinions. I always like the religious or philosophical beliefs. Anyway, trade union membership is another one, genetic data, biometric data for identification, health, sex life, sexual orientation. There is a list. There's a list of particularly sensitive data that you must not use for profiling. Now, so far so good, and I think most people will agree that's a good thing to have. The tricky thing is, and this is where the research kicks in, it's actually not so easy to clearly say, so when are you using this information or not? So I give you one example. The classic one is geographical location. Let's say in the US, if you live in a certain neighborhood and you have a certain income, that is probably in some areas a very good indicator of your race or color of skin. Is that also included here or not? This is a very tricky question because the postal code, for example, may still have some relevant non-discriminatory information about your creditworthiness. And that is something that is not very clear at this point in time how far this goes. Some large consultancy company have argued they can nowadays, using thousands of variables about all sorts of things, they can basically predict a person's health status close to what's possible, or actually they are arguing at the same level of what's possible with a typical examination that you would do for health insurance, what do you call it? Life insurance? Yeah. And is that the same thing or not? It's not very clear, but I just want to point out that this is an important question that we will see addressed. And what the GDPR does, it addresses the question by saying, well, at least as a minimum, data subjects, that's me and you, need to be informed about automated decision making when you are the subject of automated decision making. Yeah? So the way this is formulated is the data subject shall have the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on an automated processing, including profiling, which produces legal efforts concerning him or her, or similarly significantly affects him or her. So the classical example of creditworthiness being automatically decided is no longer legal in a sense. As a minimum, you have to be informed, and the decision must not be completely automatic. Again, of course, in practice, what this means is not fully clear. So is it not automatic if, for example, someone looks at the screen, the computer says no, and then the person says, oh, no. Yeah. Is that still automatic or not? Probably, right? But of course, again, what this means in practice and how to sort of avoid that this is automatic, we will see in the future. So the precise implications are very unclear. This has created a lot of discussion also in research. Because it is not fully clear whether this is just a right to information or a right to explanation. If it would mean a right to explanation, so explaining what the algorithm does, then we are in deep trouble as computer scientists, because sometimes we just cannot explain what the algorithm does. So it's now mostly interpreted as a right to information. That will probably tell you, yes, you have been subject to algorithmic decision making, and yes, these are the variables that are taken into account, but not fully explaining every detail of the algorithm. So these are just some of the cases, probably the most interesting ones also from a research perspective. The sectors that you will see most affected are obviously those that deal with sensitive data, such as e-health. Online marketing is another one, but there will be a separate regulation just for online marketing. It could mean that Europe positions itself as a kind of safe haven for personal data. It's not fully clear. It will depend on how strict the rules will be followed through and executed. But if they are, then it's actually a very different framework from what we are used to what we used to have in the past. The biggest challenge for companies will be how to use personal data while still preserving privacy. So there are, of course, ways such as anonymization. There can be little data approaches as opposed to big data approaches, where you try to do things with as little data as possible. You will have to maybe selectively delete data as soon as it's no longer required. And there can be things like privacy-aware machine learning approaches that technically know that they're dealing with sensitive data and try also to use as little as possible. So these are all very interesting questions. We will see, I think, quite a dynamic development there, because the GDPR also says you always have to stick to what is the state of the art. Especially for large companies, this also means that you will have special officers in place who need to know about data protection and be engineers, basically in computer science, and they have to make sure that this is actually implemented in the company. There are special rules for that in the GDPR. I'm not going to talk about this because this by itself is relatively complex. So, but as I said, for all these areas, from giving consent to anonymization, forgetting will become a hot topic as well. Explaining, ethical profiling on privacy by design. These are the things that we will see much more. These are opportunities for innovation as well. So if, for example, giving consent will actually change the way we do this. In the future, we will see much more machine-to-machine negotiation, rather than you clicking yes to basically whatever is said in the conditions that you are clicking. All right, there are famous experiments where people get access to Wi-Fi and say that they will clean the floor afterwards. So that may no longer be possible in the future, because the computers will know what your preferences are, and the computer may negotiate with the other computer whether that's actually what you want to do or not. But this is going to be a subject of research. And it's also one of the areas that we are interested in this project. But I think I'll probably stop here just by summarizing that this is a very good time to thinking about IT innovation and these European rules, especially if you are processing data of Europeans in any way, because then you will be affected. I forgot to mention these new rules apply regardless of where the data is processed. So it's a global rule. The Commission will define with some states rules for implementing this. As far as I know, New Zealand is one of the countries that has pretty much the same standards as Europe, so it will be relatively easy for the Commission also to follow through with entities here in New Zealand to make sure that they actually implement this. But as I said, it's going to be a major change. There is currently a hiring craze in Europe for experts in data protection, so it's a very good job opportunity. We just changed that, sorry. This will also be a subject in the EU-Australian and in the EU-New Zealand trade regulations, obviously, to make sure that these rules are also adhered to. So it's a range, as always in regulation. It's a lot of work, but it's also a whole range of opportunities for collaboration. And I think I'll just leave it there.
Thank you very much, Eric. I think you'll agree, a pretty fascinating talk that covers, when you think, I feel like we've covered computer science, kind of machine learning, we've covered kind of business strategy, we've even done some philosophy this morning, so really quite intriguing. But I'm left with the impression that while Europe's leading the way on this stuff, there there's a lot still in play. You know, a lot of times you sort of said, oh, we'll find out what this means in due course, and things are still, so for, I guess we'll have some questions now, and inviting the online participants to throw through some questions. Hamish is going to look after that. But if I could offer the first question, I guess from the point of view of a company in New Zealand that's grappling with this still to settle down kind of situation, you know, what are some practical steps they can take as they're developing a product or service? Maybe they're yet to get into market in Europe, and so what can they do to kind of mitigate the risk that they fall foul of some of the things you've talked about, or how do they exploit the opportunity as well?
So the first thing to do is there is actually a very good website maintained by the European Commission, which is about the GDPR, easy to find GDPR, European Commission, and the GDPR has its own website, and it nicely summarizes the most important things to implement. And what I would recommend is to start with those items that are most likely to happen. What's most likely to happen? Most likely is that you need to look into how do you currently request consent? How would you inform a citizen, a European citizen, if he or she asks about which kind of data do you have about me? Do you actually need this? How did you get it? So you need to develop answers to these, or you need to delete the data. It's as easy as that. But that's where I would start, and then let the more complicated cases perhaps see how the situation is going to emerge. So some of the details. But yes, you have to absolutely make sure that you adhere to the rules, because they will be followed through, and the Commission has been very tough. I mean, of course, the focus has been on the bigger players. So for lack of huge, massive platform providers in New Zealand, maybe you will be a bit safer, but in the end, you have to implement it.
Yeah. Okay, well then we're into it.
On that note, are there any formalized safe haven or safe harbor provisions within the rules?
This is a very tricky one. Yes, there are rules regarding that, and you have to look it up in detail, because it really depends on the state. But by and large, the rules I talk about have to be adhered to. There are exceptions also for security services and things like that. So whenever we're talking about, it's ridiculous anyway, we're talking about what secret services do. That is not the subject of the data protection regulation, but in terms of sort of agreements between states, they need to be based on agreements between the European Union and that state. And this is also going to be a subject of negotiations in the future. So we'll see how that, but there's no automatic recognition of the past.
And there's no threshold for company size or things like that?
No. There is a threshold with respect to what you're required to implement. You need data protection officers from a certain size of the company.
And presumably it becomes very important to document that you've been on the GDPR website and look at what's required, and you've acted in good faith to try and implement what you're recommending. You might inadvertently fall foul.
So the question is if it's sort of it's important to do your best and act in good faith and document it. I think that will help, but you cannot stop there. I think it's a factual set of obligations you have, and you have to make sure that they are fulfilled. There is when it comes to the punishment, then there is a difference whether you voluntarily, not voluntarily, what's the word? Deliberately, thank you. Whether you deliberately did something wrong or not, but that's just the difference in punishment. So I'm not sure you want to go there.
Just a quick, kind of slightly frivolous, but maybe not question, is do you see there's a possibility of providers of all sizes possibly being overwhelmed with millions of people requesting information or whatever?
Yes, there is such a possibility, and that has, of course, been heavily debated by industry in the discussions leading up to these implementations. On the other hand, we are not starting from scratch. We already had similar rights to information in the previous regulations, and we have not seen, massive, like thousands of people requesting their data erased or things like that. There are interesting studies when you look into who is actually asking about data erasure and or who is actually trying to get access to their data. So I don't think this is going to happen, but it might happen. There is, for example, there are new civil initiatives who will make sure you can sign up with those initiatives. There's a famous Austrian one because we have this, what used to be a student of law, Max Schrems. He sued Facebook very prominently and lost at one and lost at one, and actually may have contributed to this regulation. And he created a new initiative where you can sign up with, and they will defend your rights for you. There is one thing that has become slightly more difficult. I said in the beginning that there are arguments about whether the rules have made things easier or more difficult. One is that in the future you may, as a citizen in Europe, I may have to go to the data authority of the country where the company is based that infringes my rights. That is different from now, because now I can do it in my country. And we will see how this will work when a Maltese citizen requests in Maltese from the Irish Data Protection Office to get help. But yeah, that's things that we will sort out.
We'll take one more question from the floor, and then I'll check if there are questions online.
So if you have like an enterprise software as a service product, a private company is using it, it's all password protected, etc. And let's say you're logging a safety incident. Joe Blogs is recorded as causing an incident and injuring someone else. Joe Blogs leaves. What happens for the company who needs that record of incidents legally for safety law? But Joe wants his records removing from that enterprise SaaS of his previous employer.
Joe Blogs is like your random standard male example guy.
You have to repeat the example for me. I lost it halfway through.
So, and a safety incident is logged.
Yeah.
And Joe was the instigator, so it's important that he's kept on file.
Yeah.
He leaves the company and requests his data to be deleted.
As always in law, there is a trade-off between keeping that information and having it deleted. And that's probably when you have to. So what the regulation says is precisely that you have to weigh that against. And maybe the way to answer it is you may be able to keep it until that sort of case has been settled, and then you can delete it. Yeah? But you will have to make this decision, and you may also have to ask simply the court what should be done in this very special case. So, but it is the commission. The GDPR makes it very clear that, of course, these are not absolute rights. They are always relative to other rights we have and others have. So, for example, this free speech and many of the things I talked about also conflict with each other, and you have to make a case-by-case decision, and that is very clear. And there is no general answer.
So, Hamish, are there any questions coming through on the online forum?
Yeah, we do have a couple coming through. One, it's a practical one, I guess, to start. In terms of if you're a New Zealand company, that there's a privacy breach and it could impact EU citizens. Who are the authorities that you need to alert and then being clear on the process?
Yeah, in the future there will be a clearly identified authority in Europe, even for overseas companies. So that is part of the regulation, and that is the one that needs to be informed. Apart from informing the subjects, the data subjects themselves, there are of course footnotes to this, so there are exceptions where you do not have to inform the data subject, which is, for example, when doing that would make things worse. And also if you can sort of, as a company, by taking countermeasures, for example, encrypting things, so that whoever infringed the system cannot do anything with the data, then you do not have to inform the data subjects. Yeah? So there are some more detailed rules.
Any other questions?
Yep, so there's a company with a SaaS product. They're currently not in the EU market. However, their clients have EU residents in their systems. Do they need to appoint a representative in the EU under the new rules? Or what are the considerations that they need to have?
So yes, they need to look into this, absolutely. They may not need a representative, but they have to look into it's actually, the term used in the GDPR is EU resident. So it's not based on nationality, which makes things slightly worse.
Good to know. Now, I'm hoping that I can't do it yet. Are there regulations on supporting enterprises making decisions using personal data? So, for example, telling Aldi how many potatoes to buy, but one of the input variables could include the number of conversations by gender or age demographics.
What was the question? Well, that is certainly relevant. Yes, you need to look into this. Yeah. You will be subject to the GDPR if that's the question.
Yeah. So,
as long as it depends, of course. So here, this is a very good example. If this recommendation is based on very general assessments of how consumers behave in general, without being able to identify a personal, an individual, then it's not personal data. Then it doesn't affect things. Also, one important thing to keep in mind, anonymization is a technique that is useful, but it does not mean that the data is no longer personal data. Actually, the GDPR is quite clear that even when personal data is anonymized, it's still personal data.
I'm just pleased that with the mention of potatoes, we can add horticulture to the topics covered this morning. Any other questions from the room? Yeah.
Okay, we have a health product which is being used in the EU already. This whole right to be forgotten thing again, or no, even someone requesting their data. Basically, we sell our software to clinics who store data about their patients. Mm-hmm. Our kind of take on it, ideally, would be that if the patient wants access to the data, they go to the clinic, because there's all sorts of, it's complicated. If someone's psychotic or whatever, you need to have a doctor in the mix. We're not in the position to give away health data. And the other aspect of it is that we're not allowed to see that data. We don't see the data, the clinic sees the data. So we give the clinic the ability to delete records, but we don't really feel comfortable running around deleting people's records for them out of a clinic. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. As I said before, I didn't go into this level of detail. There is the distinction between the entity that sort of sells the service and the entity that processes the data, both of which are subject to regulation. So it doesn't help you if you sort of if you have the server somewhere in in Iceland and your company is in Australia. So that doesn't change things at all. And there's also no practical distinction between the company who where you buy the service from and that actually processes it, so that they are all the same and they're all subject to this. But if you do not store the data yourself, and it is in a clinic, then it's the clinic's authority in most cases.
Well, we have it on the cloud, right? So right now it's in Australia.
Yeah, you are full subject to that regulation.
How though?
I see a lot of business opportunities for consulting now. Yes, you are. You are holding the data. Theoretically, people could come to you and ask you.
Okay, and
even if it's in Australia. Australia is a bad example because Australia doesn't fulfill
we're looking at running up an instance in Ireland just to keep
that doesn't change things. It's completely irrelevant.
Yeah.
I think in that scenario, so you're saying the data is encrypted and it's blind to you, so you can't see the information? Is that right?
Yeah, well, kind of. I mean, to be honest, you know, we have ways. We could get at it. We really had to. But the point is that there's a lot of medico-legal stuff around delivering people. Yeah, they do own their data, but what if they're psychotic or, you know, there's all these edge cases in health.
No. You need to look into it. You need to, it's, the rules are very specific and relatively clear, I think. So, I mean, I mentioned a lot of that's not fully clear, and it's just because in court cases always things can pop up and be interpreted differently. But when you look at the regulation, I think it's fairly clear, and it will tell you also what you probably have to do in terms of informing people or deleting people's records. I think these are the most important things that you have to look into.
So that's the other thing is that you have to store someone's records legally as a clinician. You have to store someone's records for 10 years or 7 years or whatever. So how can you go around deleting patient records? Like,
not fully clear which right is going to be stored.
right,
I think
Probably the GDPR.
right.
Probably the data protection laws, because they are at a very high level in the law system.
Okay.
I think if I can just make a quick comment on that. I think the point you've raised is probably the most important I've heard this morning in some ways, because if you take it out of the realm of very sensitive data like health data, any of us who are providing SaaS services or have servers anywhere doing things, this would apply to, even though we would think that the control of that data is with our clients. And so I think it's actually a huge issue. I mean, just sitting here, and this is just a reactionary comment, not thought through, I would choose not to do business, therefore, with clients in that area.
No, I just wanted to say that should not be the conclusion. No, because I mean, even if I mentioned the 20 million sort of fine that you can be given, I mean, what's the first thing that's reasonably going to happen? Someone will ask you, do you store data, and what kind of data? And then in most cases you will be able to answer that request, so that's fine. And it's only when things, I think, when you are starting to systematically really, most of GDPR is targeting existing practices of selling people's data and using them for purposes to which they have not given consent. That is the main direction of the GDPR. And as long as you're not doing that, I think you're pretty safe.
But you need to be able to
You need to be able to answer, you need to be able to delete, and things that, and some of them,
Do you think the middle ground in all of this is a soft delete? Where you were talking about on the break the link, but it's still sitting there to cover off your 10 years or your 7 years, but it still stops a lot of that frivolous unwarranted information?
The short answer is no, I don't think so. The old regulations did make distinctions between soft and hard delete, so soft delete and physical deletion. I don't think the GDPR does that anymore. So I cannot fully answer your question. I would have to look it up. It's a very interesting question. I don't think that's a way out. Is my short answer.
We're just going to give the online guys a chance to ask a couple of questions. So Hamish.
Yeah, so just a few more here. So how does it affect the capture of CCTV data that can identify people's forms but not necessarily know who they are?
Yeah,
that's a broader beyond CCTV.
It's again, that is true. It's a very tricky one. It may fall under what I said about anonymization. So it may be anonymous, but it's still personal data. But not in all cases. There are some clever cameras nowadays who will just give you some general information. For example, a person going in the wrong direction. That obviously I think that would probably not be personal data because the person is not identifiable.
Or if the video capture is encrypted, so they can't use it out, so it's an image is clearly identifiable. It's about the effort you put into to identify that person. But if the company has encrypted it, then it can't be used outside of the company if it's hacked. Potentially,
But it's still personal data.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
two more here. We've got a SaaS product and our data is stored on servers in the US. Do we need to move the EU clients to EU servers?
No, it doesn't change a thing. It does not change anything where the data is processed. This is made very clear in the GDPR. It would be useless nowadays to make this distinction.
And this one for the audience here. Has anyone found a New Zealand lawyer who can help interpret for a SaaS company?
I was nearly going to ask that question.
I have two, but they're one's in London and one's in New York. Actually, they both use London. I've activated two English lawyers for the whole privacy policy issue.
And they've been quite useful.
Amazing. So I've come here with 9 months already of learning this, and this has been really great strategically. I've got a good handle on it, but it's really good to have more conversations. But I have engaged a UK lawyer for this.
So
And everything I do with privacy policy goes through them, because I don't think lawyers in other countries really are confident about it either, because of the ambiguity. That's it. The person who doesn't speak English can say that. Yeah, there because of that, and nothing's been tested. Like, I find it really curious that Google are getting around the right to not erase. They're just disconnecting the data from public, and that's not what the law says.
Yeah.
So everybody's going, oh, what's going to happen to them? Right?
But on the other hand, I have to say, I find it fascinating how the big companies, you mentioned Google, also Facebook, are jumping on this and actually doing all the right things to implement this. Because they know they will be the first target of the European Commission. But really, you see a lot of changes, and even the browser producers nowadays. They changed the way to give consent, the way they deal with cookies and all that. So the large ones are actually implementing this, maybe because they have hundreds of lawyers working for them and telling them what to do. But yes.
So just sorry to just finish off on that question, because I think going to London or to somewhere in Europe to find a lawyer that can consult on behalf of a New Zealand company can be quite a daunting task as well. How did you go about doing that process?
So I'm happy to plug the guys that I found. They're called Harbottle in London. How do I do that process? I actually had colleagues in England for different things, and I said, oh, hey, do you have some attorneys that I think it was actually different law that I was inquiring about. And then once I was in there, I said, do you have privacy law specialists in the firm? And they do. And so that's what you're looking for, a privacy law specialist. And for me, England was the most common, most sensible place because of the English language. But then, in Europe, if working in Germany or whatever, the lawyers have excellent language. So I kind of felt choosing a lawyer within Europe, they've really focused on it.
Actually, there's an interesting development, because you asked the question about will it overwhelm? So, yeah. And there is an argument it may actually have a severe impact in Dublin due to Brexit and due to the English language problems. So everybody is now likely to go to Ireland.
That's true.
And so this is actually what might happen.
But they're all very like, oh, God, we keep asking the question, what's going to happen in England? Then so they're really trying to grapple with that. So they're really thinking about it.
Thinking about it, because they probably will have to adhere to the laws anyway.
Yes, that's what they think.
So we're just about out of time. Just checking if any last burning questions from the room.
I'm thinking yours.
Here's a burning question.
So this actually isn't about GDPR, but about the digital single market.
Yes.
Which you mentioned. So you mentioned that services have to be consistent across EU member states. But is that also the same for pricing?
Good one. I don't think so. No, not that I know of. I mean, we have. Well, no, it was probably too quick to answer that. You cannot distinguish pricing based on a person's nationality in the EU. That is, but if there are. But you can distinguish based on where they are based.
So if I want to have a cheap video on demand service, I buy it from Poland rather than from...
Yes, but of course the Polish service, Yes, but you probably have to be a resident in Poland. But you cannot distinguish by nationality. Yeah? We can talk about this. It's a bit tricky. Yeah.
Eric's going to be hanging around here for a little bit after this. So in order to kind of keep the time, we'll kind of wrap it up there. We'll say thanks very much, Eric.
Thanks for having me.
So welcoming Hamish back, who's just going to wrap up.
Oh, I guess that was pretty much it. That's a thanks to Eric. We'll be hanging around for a little bit, so if you can stay, then please do. We'll try and keep an eye on Eric for as long as possible, but may need to duck away at some point. Lingual, we've got music here still, so make yourselves at home. Thanks everyone for showing up and for joining us on the webinar. And any other questions, just feel free to fire them through to me if you're on the webinar, and we'll try and get those answered for you as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you.